All right, so this is our last video on the topic of the Enlightenment. And what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about Enlightened Absolutism. So basically, what this means is that we're going to fuse together the idea of the divine right of kings with Enlightenment ideas. So we're going to put these two things together. And basically what we're going to find is that we're going to find absolute monarchs who want to make society better for their subjects. That's what they're going to try to do. We get absolute monarchs who want to make society better for their subjects. So we're going to start with and spend most of our time in this video looking at maybe the best example of an enlightened absolute monarch, and that is Frederick the Great. So before we start talking about Frederick, it's probably time for us to start talking about Prussia. So let's put Prussia on the board. So Prussia was one of the larger and more important of the little Germanies. Their leader was one of the electors to the Holy Roman Emperor. So the leader was an elector. And we've seen a couple of electors before. We've seen the Elector of Saxony, who was Martin Luther's patron. The future kings of England are going to be the electors of Hanover. And this guy, the Elector in Prussia, is actually the Elector of Brandenburg. Or Brandenburg, Prussia. And that's where we get Prussia from. So he's an important one of the little Germanies. He's an elector, and his title is the Elector of Brandenburg, Prussia, shortened mostly just to name it Prussia. Now, the guy that kind of puts Prussia on the map and the first real important leader of Prussia, his name is the Great Elector. That's the title he has. Frederick William. And he is going to be in charge from 1640 to 1688. And he is Frederick the Great's great grandfather. One of the confusing things about Prussian history is that everybody is either named Frederick or William or Frederick William. So I'm going to try to cut out as many names as possible because they're all Frederick or William or Frederick William. And so I'm going to leave out as many names as possible just to kind of keep the story moving, because there's a lot of these same names that are going to pop up. So Frederick William is called the Great Elector because he was the one that started the process of Prussian military discipline. And the reason for that is that Prussia really has no natural defenses. Prussia has no natural defenses, and so in Frederick William's mind, the only defense they had was their military. And so he's going to start the process of turning the Prussian military into a juggernaut, something that nobody is going to want to mess with. So we're going to professionalize the army. We're going to pay the soldiers well. And we're going to invest in military science and technology. The other thing to note about Prussia is that their leaders were very good at diplomacy as well, and they expanded their territory through marriage. So they didn't need to conquer a lot of territory if they can marry their daughters into other little Germanies, which is good. They expanded their territory through the children of these marriages, but the result of this is that a lot of Prussian territory is non-contiguous, meaning that it is not connected. So there's little bits of Prussia all throughout the German territory, but it's not connected to Prussia. So these two things, professionalizing the army and having this kind of non-contiguous Prussian territory, these two things are what's going to drive what Prussia does through most of the 17th and 18th centuries and 19th centuries. Okay, so now let's jump into Frederick the Great. So Frederick the Great's father was very strict and ran the household with military discipline. So even the house that Frederick the Great was born into worked like a military barracks. It was very strict. And it didn't help that Frederick the Great was a sensitive little kid who enjoyed like French poetry and playing the flute. So he was definitely not the kind of kid that his dad wanted. He was much more intellectual and not really that interested in the military stuff. At one point, he was even removed from the line of succession because Frederick the Great's little brother was thought to be more of a military leader than Frederick was. So his little brother actually replaced him for a time at the top, or as the next in line to the throne. It's also probably the case that Frederick the Great was gay. He was probably gay. As later documents are going to show, he wasn't like really out, but it also wasn't really a secret. It was just kind of who he was, and everybody accepted him for that. So he was probably gay. He wasn't like making a big deal of it, but he also wasn't keeping it a secret. He wrote in his diaries about how he didn't really like women. But this is going to be an important thing that happens early on in his life. Early, like when he was a teenager, he and probably his boyfriend, but everything seems to suggest that they were just close friends, were going to flee Prussia and serve under Frederick the Great's uncle in England. So they were going to go serve in his military in England. So his mom's brother, who was English, they were going to go fight for him. His dad found out. And threw Frederick in prison and forced him to watch his boyfriend's execution. He was executed for treason. And then after this, Frederick the Great was forced to marry a German princess. They didn't have any children, and once his dad died, Frederick really never did anything with his wife. They did not live together. And he only really visited her once a year. Like he like set her up with a nice palace and paid for everything she wanted. He just didn't want to live with her, and he visited her once a year on her birthday. So she was not hurt. He didn't do anything to her. He gave her everything she wanted. He just didn't want to live with her, probably because he was gay. Now, once Frederick the Great's father died, whether he does this out of spite or whether he does this because he actually believes in it, Frederick fully embraces Enlightenment ideas. Like, he goes all in on the Enlightenment. So a lot of the reason why he's called Frederick the Great is because of his military brilliance, and he was a really good military tactician. And we'll circle back to these ideas of his military victories when we start talking about the lead up to the French Revolution. So right now, what we're going to look at are his domestic policies. So we're going to see him employ a lot of the stuff we've been talking about. So for instance, he was religiously tolerant. He himself, he was a Calvinist. But allowed Catholics to freely worship. He also allowed Jews to live freely, although he's mostly using them as an economic instrument. He's using them as an economic interest to, or economic instrument to trade with Polish Jews who would rather trade with other Jews than they would with Christians. So he's kind of allowing the Jews to live in Eastern Prussia to trade with the Polish Jews, but you know, he's allowing them to live there mostly free. So why he's doing it is kind of secondary to the fact that he is allowing them to live there. He promoted education and a bureaucracy of merit. The idea that we want to have government officials actually know what they're doing and be smart. He was an important art patron. And he composed music for the flute and wrote a lot of French poetry. Like we mentioned before, he lived with Voltaire for a time. And they worked together on a rebuttal to Machiavelli. He opened the Prussian Academy for Science. And the Prussian Academy for Sciences became like a real breeding ground for unorthodox scientific ideas. There was a real remarkable freedom of speech here. And on top of all of that, he was also a noted animal lover. He said that if people can't treat their loyal animals well, how can you trust people to be loyal to each other? So he actually wanted to be buried next to his greyhounds. So he always had greyhounds and he wanted to be buried next to them. They didn't honor that wish, but that's what he wanted. He was also an early environmentalist, and he promoted sustainable use of the land. So a lot of Enlightenment ideas are being used by Frederick, and he himself is kind of embodying this idea of progress, like talking about how we should treat animals and how we should treat the natural world. He's embodying the ideas of the Enlightenment. Not only the stuff that other people have talked about, but he's actually moving things forward himself. Now, with all of this being said, for all the progressive ideas he's putting forward, he didn't like the people. He didn't like them. He thought that he was above them. He was an absolute monarch. He's using Enlightenment ideas to make the people's lives better, but he doesn't like them. He's above them. He's God's lieutenant. So he's probably the best example of somebody who's actually doing what the divine right of kings says that you should do. He has this great responsibility, and so he's going to use his great power to fix people's lives. But he didn't like them. He didn't like the people. Had there been a rebellion against him, he would have destroyed it. But the people didn't rebel. They loved Frederick. Frederick was one of the most beloved Prussian leaders of all time. Okay, so that's Frederick. There's another important absolute or enlightened absolute monarch that we should probably mention, and that is Catherine the Great. To 1796. All right, so Catherine the Great of Russia. So a little bit of background on Catherine. So in between the time of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, Russia had become a major power, just like Peter wanted. So Catherine's husband, who is Peter the Third, so Peter the Great was Peter the First, this is Peter the Third, who is Catherine's husband, came to power during the 7 Years' War. Don't worry about this yet. We're going to cover this in its entirety in the run-up to the French Revolution. So don't worry about the war yet. Just know that Peter the Third, who is Catherine's husband, comes to power during the 7 Years' War. And Russia was on the other side of the war from Prussia. So Prussia and Russia are on opposite sides of the 7 Years' War. But Peter idolized Frederick. And so Peter switches sides. Catherine doesn't like this, and the Russian nobles don't like this, so they launch a coup and replace Peter with Catherine. And that's where Catherine the Great comes to power. Now, Catherine is not quite the enlightened absolute monarch that Frederick was, but she's going to do some of the same stuff. So like Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great will expand Russian territory. Like during her reign, they get Alaska. She's also going to favor education and a bureaucracy of merit. She's going to create the Russian Academy of Science. She wrote poems and plays. And she's going to fund Diderot's encyclopedia, much the same way that Frederick funded a bunch of Voltaire's stuff. Now, unlike, I'll put this over here, unlike Frederick, Catherine the Great had some rebellions. So her absolutism comes out. So the most famous of these rebellions is known as Pukachev's rebellion. And this was kind of a slow burning rebellion, which kind of caused Catherine to question her embrace of the Enlightenment. But generally speaking, Catherine was thought of as an enlightened absolute monarch, the same as Frederick. But unlike Frederick, Catherine had to actively put down a rebellion, or rebellions, plural. This is just the most famous of them. And so you can kind of see the absolute part of the enlightened absolutism come out when Catherine puts that rebellion down. Okay, so this pretty much ends the stuff on the Enlightenment. And so our next series of videos is going to be the run up to the French Revolution and Napoleon. And yeah, so the next video will start there. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.